Good morning, fellow lovers of wisdom. It is an honor to be here as your MC today because we will listen to some of the few intellectual elites and scholars, the top 10% of people in this country, to talk about, not to justify whether there is indeed a philosophy in Filipino or not, but to render a commemorative lecture on the men and women who contributed great ideas in philosophy in this country. Only the very best people in this field will take the time and make the sacrifice to come so far for a conference like this. Imagine a world without a genius mind. That's not possible. But a world without philosophy, that's not possible. In the spirit of the worldwide celebration of Philosophy Day today, teachers and philosophers throughout different topographies are gathered to listen and participate in this once in a lifetime opportunity to listen to those who exceeded their reputation beyond the university walls and contribute to the honing of philosophical ideas. All right, we will now start finally for the paper presentation. Welcome to the first panel of this morning session, which will be moderated by Dr. Danilo Alterado.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I am honored to introduce to you our first panel of speakers. For this first panel of speakers, we will give honor to Florentino Hornedo and Josephine Parisias. Our first speaker, who will speak on Florentino Hornedo's notion of freedom as autonomous energy for being, is a full professor of philosophy at the University of Santo Tomas, Manila, Philippines. He is affiliated with the Philosophy Department, Faculty of Arts and Letters, and the Center of Religious Studies and Ethics. He is the editor-in-chief of the internationally indexed Philosophia, International Journal of Philosophy. At the same time, he is the executive director, executive governor of the Philippine National Philosophical Research Society, or the PNPRS. He is a member of the Asian Association of Christian Philosophers and a former president of the Philosophical Association of the Philippines, serving from 1999 to 2012. His publications are Person, Action, and Love, The Philosophical Thoughts of Carol Wojtyła in 2014, Towards the Understanding of the Human Person in 2016, and The Good and Happy Life, an Introduction to Ethical System, 2019. He has articles published and in international journals. We have Dr. Joe Jim Aguas as our first speaker. Our second speaker, Professor Darlene Di Bandante, will speak on revisiting Josephine Parisias' hope for doing philosophy in the Philippines through feminism. Professor Darlene Di Bandante finished her MA in philosophy at the University of Santo Tomas and finished her PhD in philosophy in Macquarie University, working on the title of the thesis with the title The Political Subject and Its Experiences, an Alternative Reading of Rancheri on Political Subjectivity. Her research interest broadly revolves around the role of the subject in social and political emancipation. In particular, her aim is to investigate the relationship between the material aspect of political subjectivity and the struggle of political subjects against various forms of oppression through real, concrete, and creative means of asserting their agencies. Now, may I call now on Professor Dr. Job Jim Aguas for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Dexy, at maraming salamat sa mga nag-attend ng webinar na ito. Hopefully, maging maayos ang ating internet connections para sa ating lahat para makasabay tayo ng gusto sa ating webinar. So, my topic for this presentation is Florentino H. Ornedo's notion of freedom as autonomous energy for being. But before I go to my presentation about Dr. Ornedo, just a few words to explain the theme of our conference or webinar today. Why the groundwork of Filipino philosophy? While some Filipino scholars debate whether there is Filipino philosophy, in fact, our former professors, who we honor today, have differing opinions on this matter. The fact is, we engage in philosophical discussions, and that is a manifestation of Filipino philosophizing. The philosophical reflections and publications of these Filipino thinkers laid the groundwork of Filipino philosophy or Filipino philosophizing. Thus, we hail them as the forerunners of Filipino philosophical thoughts. In coming up with this term, I was actually indirectly inspired by the title of Kant's book, The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. But just to explain why this groundwork, our forerunners cleared the ground for us. They provided us with a space or a clearing for our future reflection in defining Filipino philosophy or Filipino philosophizing. So that's the story or the context of the theme of this webinar, the groundwork of Filipino philosophy, as a celebration of our of World Philosophy Day. And we're going to honor today 10 Filipino scholars or philosophers who have passed away, and we want to honor their contribution to the discussion on Filipino philosophy. So let me go now to my topic, Dr. Ornedo. Ornedo's notion of freedom as autonomous energy for being. So for those of us who do not know or are not familiar yet with Dr. Ornedo, Florentino Ornedo is professor of philosophy, of history, literature, education, and anthropology, and many other related fields. In our country, the Philippines, the name Florentino Ornedo is synonymous with philosophy, education, and culture. He has written so much about local history and local culture and literature based on his first-hand experience. He is from Batanes, and therefore his first-hand experience is informed by his Ibatan experiences. His passion for propagating his knowledge of philosophy, literature, history, education, and culture found expression in his numerous publications and in the numerous lectures is given in his classes and in various conferences. And personally, I was lucky to be a student in his classes. He was actually my advisor in my masteral thesis and doctoral dissertation. So I have worked closely with Dr. Ornedo. Now, Ornedo said that he does not write just for the sake of writing, but for the sake of social consciousness. A writer, he said, should not be a slave to his own writing. And I quote him, he said, identifying the core problems of human nature is one way of improving one's craft because it brings the writer closer to reality. Reality is, in a sense, helps empower social consciousness. His writings indeed, cover a wide range of issues from letters to education, from politics to ethics, and from literature to culture. Now, let me go now to the topic I'm going to discuss today about his notion of freedom. Freedom as autonomous energy for being. There are many notions of freedom, and every notion carries in itself a particular perspective or context. In our philosophy classes, we talk about freedom, and there is the existential notion of freedom, like Sartre's notion of freedom. There's also the ontological notion of freedom. We can go back to Aristotle and St. Thomas about this ontological notion of freedom. There is also the political and social notion of freedom. And there are many philosophers we can cite talking about this political or social context of freedom. And of course, there is also the axiological notion of freedom. So freedom is a notion that can be explained through different contexts or perspectives. Now, Ornedo's notion of freedom can be understood both in the context of the personal and social. First, personal, because Ornedo grounds his notion of freedom on the personal and rational nature of the human individual. Why social? Social because this notion of freedom contains a social character. That is, through this freedom, man becomes socially capable and a positive contributor not only for his personal development, but for the betterment of the social condition of himself and of the society to where he belongs. That's why it's both personal and social for Dr. Ornedo. Now, Ornedo relates freedom with empowerment and development. So he does not consider freedom simply as an abstract concept. Freedom for him is something that is dynamic. Freedom is something that can contribute to the empowerment of people and to the development of society. Of course, in today's society, we often speak of empowerment as a key component in people's struggle to free themselves from the often recurring cycles of modern forms of oppression, discrimination, you know, uh, exploitation. There are just so many modern forms of oppressions. We can actually say that fake news is a modern form of oppression. But how can people be empowered? How can freedom be a kind of empowerment? It is common to understand freedom as the absence of any form of determination, whether externally or internally. Such negative conception of freedom, like freedom as simply an absence of all antecedent necessity, can never be a source of empowerment. Freedom can be a source of empowerment if we recognize the positive side or aspect of freedom, if we recognize it as a positive force in the world, as a real agent, as a real cause of something that is positive, meaning it can become a source of empowerment if it becomes the agent or the cause of something that is really good and beneficial, not only for the person, but for the society at large. But the question again is, how can freedom be positive? Or, in what sense can freedom be positive? So, Ornedo discusses this notion of freedom in his book, Power to Be, the Phenomenology of Freedom. And in this book, Ornedo defines freedom as a kind of strength, a dynamic capacity, a power to be, a kind of autonomous energy. Now, incidentally, this book, the first edition of this book, was published months after martial law was declared in the Philippines by the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos in 1972. And of course, we know what happened during the martial law. So this book was shelved only to reappear in its second edition in 2000. So this is Ornedo's contribution to our understanding of what freedom is. So freedom for him is a capacity, a power, capacity of power to make action, especially for development and justice possible. Freedom empowers the human person. It capacitates him to develop himself. Now, to be able to grow and develop, one must be free. Whenever and wherever that capacity or that power is absent, there's no freedom. And where and when there is no freedom, there is no development or advancement, either in the person or the society. So Dr. Ornedo is very emphatic in this expression of what freedom is as a source of empowerment and development. Now, based on this understanding, he developed the idea of freedom as autonomous energy for being. And it is my humble contribution to the further exploration or explanation of this concept that I offer this presentation as a way of explicating what Dr. Ornedo meant by this notion of freedom as autonomous energy for being. According to Dr. Ornedo, there are three elements of this kind of freedom. First, autonomy. Second, energy. And third, being. Okay, so I'm going to discuss what are these three elements, autonomy, energy, and being, as expounded by Dr. Ornedo. First, autonomy. Autonomy is the condition of being self-governing. A thing is autonomous when it is self-governing. And to govern is to determine one's own act and execute one's own will. This idea of autonomy is very much similar, very much related to Karol Wojtyła's or John Paul II's notion of freedom as self-determination. Now, there are two important aspects here. First, the condition to determine oneself and to determine one's action. Self and action. So, freedom is not just the absence of determination from the outside, but first and foremost, it is that condition where one can determine his own self or create his own self. And of course, when we talk of determining ourself, creating ourself, that rings a bell about the many existentialist philosophers who talk about this notion of creating oneself. Sartre, for example, and the other existentialist philosophers like Nietzsche, or even Kierkegaard, or even Heidegger. Okay? So, when one is free, he can determine the course of his own action. He can contemplate on what he wants to do and how he will do it. Okay? So, autonomy in this sense implies not only the possession of the capacity or power of action, but also the independence of the agent from external necessity and external power in order to actualize its own will. That's this basic notion of freedom, that we are independent from external factors. Okay? Autonomy implies the condition of self-direction, independent of every intended entity, extraneous to its simplest and most fundamental selfhood. However, according to Dr. Ornedo, autonomy should not be interpreted as something that excludes intrinsic dependence of the autonomous being upon its own internal constitutive principle. In other words, yes, we are externally independent, but we are internally dependent. In other words, we don't depend on other people when we are free, but we depend on ourselves. In other words, we determine our own selves. We are not determined by outside forces, but we determine our own self. That's the meaning of intrinsic dependence of Dr. Ornedo. So selfhood is always understood in terms of its intrinsic and natural constitution. And therefore, the self is always bound and is dependent on its natural and intrinsic constitution. Now, of course, you're going to ask, what do you mean, or what do we mean by natural and intrinsic constitution? Dr. Nedo explains it this way. This intrinsic dependence makes the existence of the self possible. In this sense, autonomy has two poles. First is independence from external factors or forces, and the second is dependence on our internal or natural constitution. So while man is not determined by external forces, he is determined by his own self, by his intrinsic and natural constitution. Now, one of the intrinsic determining properties of man is rationality. That's one essential property of our natural and intrinsic constitution, that we have reason, that we are rational. So man determines his own action by relying on his rational capacities. Autonomy, therefore, is bound to rationality. We become authentically autonomous when we use our own reason to the fullest. The Cornedo has a very nice way of putting it. By acting rationally, which is the predetermining constitutive law of his human nature, he acts more freely. So in other words, an action rationally considered is a freer act. We become free when we use our reason. And if we're going to just be governed by our irrational desires, then that means we are not free, because we are governed by our irrational appetites. Now, the second point, energy. Energy is often associated with physical sciences than the metaphysical, right? In the natural and physical sciences, we always talk about energy, energy, energy. Even in our beverage, we always use the word energy, energy, giving us all this energy. Now, in philosophy, the preferred term is potency, as expounded by St. Thomas Aquinas. Okay, potency, capacity, the power. But Dr. Nedo used the word energy. The term potency has a more specific connotation as possibility. Energy, on the other hand, in its common and ordinary sense, means capacity or activity or available power. Available power. That's energy. So if there is a brownout, no available power. Therefore, we are not energized. If we don't eat, if we didn't have breakfast this morning, there's no energy, no available power. Okay? So brownout, no internet connection, no power, no energy. You cannot attend this webinar. Now, when this notion is applied, this energy is applied to human activity. To have energy is to be ready and prepared to act. So when one is energized, he becomes dynamic. He is ready to take action. So if you have taken your breakfast, for example, this morning, you're energized. You become dynamic. Okay? So you have the power, you're energized to attend this webinar up to the very end, up to 5 o'clock p.m. Because if you don't stay until 5 o'clock p.m., you don't have the energy to stay on, sorry, you're not going to get any certificate. So the point is, if we are energized, then we are ready to take action. So the capacity to act and to determine one's action becomes actualized And one becomes, when it becomes actualized, and one becomes empowered. So to be empowered is to be dynamic, to have this available energy. Okay. So in some cases, an individual may have the natural capacity to do certain things, but when he is not empowered, he cannot perform. So yes, we are autonomous, but without energy, we cannot exercise that autonomy. Yes, we have the power to determine our actions, but if we are not energized, we don't have the energy, how can we perform? Okay? So a man may have the capacity to study, but if he's not empowered, he cannot do it. So with energy, freedom becomes dynamic force, not just a static capacity. I remember one of the examples of Dr. Nedo in our class. He said, yes, these people, the poor, they have the capacity to learn, they have the capacity to study. But because of their poor economic condition, they are not empowered, they are not energized, they don't have the capacity to study. You have the capacity to buy, he said. But when you reach out to your pocket, kuha ka ng, dinukot mo yung bulsa mo, pagtingin mo, wala kang pera, paano ka bibili? In other words, freedom should not just be an empty concept. It must be able to empower you to do the things that you are capable of. So this notion of energy as a dynamic capacity for activity or available power is more related to the notion of autonomy as rational self-government or self-determination. So freedom as autonomy or self-determination is futile when man is not empowered or when he lacks the dynamism, when he lacks the energy, when he lacks this available power. Autonomy, as conceptually considered, is rather inert. Its expression and manifestation requires action. And what will ensure action of this autonomy? Well, energy, this available power, this dynamics. So such autonomous action becomes actual when there is an available power or capacity for action. Energy then is the capacity or the power to actualize our economy or autonomy, the power for actualization of autonomy. So autonomous energy, therefore, means that force or power in the rational being, in us, which makes possible the modes of his operations and his faculties. Because we have the faculties, but if we don't have this autonomous energy, we will not be able to actualize our faculties or actualize our potentials. So broadly, energy can be applied to the power in the rational being, which makes possible the operation and actualization of its faculties and all other possible modes of the being's operations. With autonomous energy, the person is able to act and perform the many functions that he is capable of. He becomes dynamic and active. Autonomous energy is the power that precedes every action, the power that sustains it, the available power that is at the disposal of the operations of the mind and its various instrumentalities. Now let's move on to the third element, the last, being. What is being? Okay, and again, in philosophy, we have heard many notions or explanations about being. So, being as used in philosophy appears to have at least two distinct modes of usage. Okay, and the Cornell explains these two modes as the substantive and the participial. Substantive and participial. In its substantive usage, being is used as a noun, and it is synonymous to that which exists or that which in any way is. So this is something metaphysics. It's something metaphysical or ontological, if you prefer. On the other hand, being used as a participle refers to the act of existence. Okay? The act of existence. In the first meaning of being, meaning in the substantival or the substantial, something is already finished and its essence is somehow already determined and done. We're finished. We're like the en soi of Sartre. Okay? So, this notion of being can be applied to objects whose essences are already secured. Okay? They are entities, according to Heidegger. Scientists. This is similar to what Sartre calls the en soi or the in itself, as I have already mentioned. This notion of being cannot be applied to freedom, according to Ornedo, because there's no freedom that we can speak of with regards to beings that are already determined, whose essence have already been determined from the outside. So stones, okay, your laptops or gadgets, any other object, they're not free because their essences have already been determined for themselves. And therefore, according to Ornedo, we cannot apply freedom to these kinds of beings. The later sense of being, that is, being as act, is what we refer here and what we apply to freedom. Because when you say being as an act, in other words, it's not yet finished. It's still open. It has so many possibilities. We can become somebody else. We can become something else. We can become somebody. Now, this participial sense is the more dynamic meaning of being, according to Dr. Ornedo. It means something is not yet finished, that it is still in the process of becoming what it can really be. We're not finished. We can still become a better person. So if you are a spreader of fake news, if you are incompetent, you can be a spreader of truth and you can be competent. There's the promise to that. Well, of course, as far as Dr. Nedo is concerned. But of course, it will depend on the person whether he wants to be a spreader of truth and competence or not. So, this is related to what I have already mentioned, Heidegger's notion of being as the being of man as the Dasein. The being of man is not yet. It's not yet completed. It's not yet finished. Man must develop and actualize himself to become the being or person he can be. And remember, one of the very first reflection papers that Dr. Nedo required us to write in our existentialism class in the grad school is to write a paper about I am my project. That's actually inspired by our readings on Sartre, on Marcel, on Buber, on the many other existentialist philosophers that we discuss in this class. I am my project. And becoming your own project is not possible if, number one, you are not dynamic and you are not autonomous, and if you are already complete. Therefore, to be free is to become, and he can only be the human or the being or human individual that he can be when he has the autonomous energy to become somebody. Thus, to be free is not to be static or stagnant, but to be dynamic, to grow, to develop, to reach a much fuller existence. Now, conclusion, because I'm excited already. I can talk on and on and on. So let me just conclude this presentation. To conclude, for Dr. Ornedo, freedom is not just some free volition of the will or the independence from external factors. For him, it is the power to be, the power to actualize ourselves. And to be free is to be dynamic, to become somebody, to actualize ourselves, to develop our potentials. So freedom as an autonomous energy for being is a capacity, a dynamic capacity for the power of the human person. First, to develop himself and attain a higher level of existence, personally, socially, politically, culturally, and spiritually. Next, execute his own actions through his own determination based on his rational nature. So I hope you have learned a lesson or two from this presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Aguas, for this illuminating discussion on the notion of freedom and making us remember and honor the person and wisdom of Professor Dr. Florentino Ornedo. For your questions, please make use of our chat section of our YouTube Live, and we will entertain questions after the second speaker. At this point, may I call now our second speaker, Professor Dr. Darlene Demandante. Take it away, ma'am.
Hi everyone and a pleasant morning to all of you. First, I would like to thank PNPRS for giving me the chance to pay tribute to one of my mentors in philosophy, Dr. Josephine Pasricha. So what I will be doing today is reading the tribute paper which I prepared. Don't worry, it's just 2,300 words. So you can either read with me or listen to um, my talk. So the paper is entitled Revisiting Josephine Pasricha's Hopes for Doing Philosophy in the Philippines Through Feminism. I'm probably the least qualified to give a tribute to Dr. Pasricha. I wasn't privileged to be her thesis advisee because I work on a topic which doesn't fall under her expertise. However, when I found not a single person who encouraged me in pursuing the MA thesis topic that I wanted to write, because I was told that it was not marketable, Dr. Pasricha was one of the few who urged me to keep going on. I still managed to keep the note that she left behind in my thesis proposal, and in fact, I couldn't bring myself to throw it away despite numerous attempts at spring cleaning. These are some of the best things that you will get from Dr. Pasricha: support, encouragement, and a pair of listening ears. Where most professors were perfectionists who did not allow us to make mistakes and who made it a point to penalize us when we committed blunders, like some inaccuracies in our interpretation of the philosophers, or giving an unbalanced analysis of the text we were asked to read, Dr. Pastricia provided us safe spaces to process our ideas by encouraging us to speak up, share our insights, and work on our own mistakes. I never once heard her say, "You're wrong," or that you don't understand this and that. Rather, she would say, "How about think of it this way? That's interesting. However, you might want to explore this," and so on. And if she was unsure of how to answer our questions, she would admit to it in front of our students. And she was even willing to be corrected if she was at fault. It was in those pockets of safe spaces that we were allowed to grow, flourish, and find our own voice as thinkers. Now, this might not have been significant for the well versed and confident students, but for someone like me and other students like me, who is in a perpetual struggle to find a voice in philosophy, it meant the world. Dr. Pasricha understood the value of empowering her students, especially her female students, because as a woman herself, she understood our struggle against underrepresentation in the male dominated discipline of philosophy. We are no stranger to the fact that philosophy is a male dominated discipline. In the Philippines, purportedly big four universities, where there are existing departments of philosophy, the range of the proportion of female faculty members is between 32 to 35%. Outside of Manila, the data is not any better. For example, in the University of San Carlos, Cebu, only 22% of philosophy faculty are women, and in Ateneo de Davao, only 29% are women. Only the faculty profile of the University of the Philippines, Baguio, looks promising in terms of equality in gender distribution. However, while this looks good, it could not stand to ensure that female philosophy faculties do not or did not go through a number of negative experiences, or whether the procedures for hiring faculties, tenureship, and research environment provided equal opportunities for all genders. As my way of paying forward, one of my mentors in philosophy, I will share some insights about Pasricha's project of doing philosophy in the Philippines through feminism, and in the process, re echo some of her recommendations and hopes about how to improve doing philosophy in the Philippines via engagement with feminist philosophy and women's studies, or simply by being sensitive to the women in our midst. Up to date, no one has written about Pasricha's works since she's not as famous as Emerita Quito, whom she recognizes as one of her intellectual masters, calling herself a disciple of Quito. And in the Philippines, we have had a bad habit of paying tribute to our mentors after they have transitioned to the next life. Hopefully, this is a habit that we are starting to shed off, and we acquire the new practice of celebrating the works of the thinkers who came before us by engaging with our scholarship while they are still alive. So, first, I will talk about Dr. Pasricha's life and significant contributions to philosophy in the Philippines. There will be times that I will use the very words that she used to describe her works as a gesture of allowing her to speak for herself, even if she's no longer with us. So, Dr. Josephine Maxima Acosta Pasricha was a Ford Foundation Fellow at the University of Delhi from 1976 to 1977, where she studied Oriental aesthetics and philosophy. In 2000, she finished her doctorate in philosophy summa cum laude in the University of Santo Tomas with a dissertation entitled A Hermeneutic Translation in Filipino and Gadamerian Meditation of the Indian epic Ramayana. This is the only existing translation of the Hindu epic in Filipino. As far as my limited knowledge is concerned, Pastricia is one of the two foremost Indologists in the Philippines, the other one being her mentor, Dr. Juan R. Francisco. For a lack of community which would appraise her work, Pastricia took the task of asserting the significance of her contribution to the field in her 2000 inaugural article in Karunungan, a Journal of Philosophy, wherein she described her contribution in the following words. Pasricha Ramayana in Filipino is a real and original contribution to Philippine literature, in particular, and Indian or Asian literature in general. It opens up new cross-cultural and multi-leveled approaches to literature. It opens the reader to possibilities of reading and interpreting the Ramayana in the literal, descriptive, formal, archetypal, anagogic levels. It gives an immense opportunity for for the Filipino reading public to read, understand, and appreciate the Ramayana in its most original text. The Pasricha Ramayana in Filipino emphasizes the need for translation of classical literary pieces into the local language and dialects to make them available to the masses, a program that is encouraged and financed even by UNESCO. Masterpieces in the West and East should be translated into the Filipino language and also into local dialects to make them available to the Filipinos and ultimately to interact with, stretch, and reinforce Philippine literature. It recommends the necessity for a center of translation studies and the need to establish translation studies as a serious discipline in its own right, separate from literature, not just a subcategory of comparative literature. There's a need for a center in the country that specializes in translating literary works from regional dialects into Filipino to discover poets, fictionists, dramatists whose work lay hidden in the past and in the provinces to enrich Philippine literature. True to her commitment to translation studies and developing a philosophy of translation, she later edited Marvin Reyes and Pasas Panganiban's Filipino translation of the Kama Sutra. Pasricha was interested in an array of topics: Indian philosophy, aesthetics, case study method, systems thinking, translation and philosophy of translation, Vaitiwa's theology of the body. But outside the academe, she wrote about her experiences as a mother and about raising her daughters and students as empowered women. In a number of different articles she wrote for Philippine Star, Pasricha would highlight a key guiding principle in her works, that is, women empowerment. Allow me to read some of the passages from her articles, where Pasricha often talked about her personal commitment to empowering women. And she wrote, all these 25 years, both as a university professor and a mother, I have brought up girls and women who are empowered to become self actualized. I taught them that power is not a substance or material entity that can walk up and down the corridors. You do not meet power in the streets, or do you? Power is a relationship between a power sender and a power receiver. The power sender, the superior or dominant by virtue of position and or resources, exercises power over the other. The power receiver, the inferior or the dominated. I've always thought that I am successful in empowering my female students and my own daughters in fighting against oppression and marginalization by the male within the context of a happy family. A woman owes it to herself to take care of her own health, her physical and emotional well being, to get the best education up to the highest that could be afforded, to start a career track, earn and save and invest her own money before getting married and having children. For 1,000 years of history on earth have never proven that any man, prime minister, president, royalty, or genius is worth the sacrifice of a woman's self actualization. For 25 years, I have recited the mantra of empowerment. One inoculates oneself against the domineering power center. One refuses to be a power receiver or a doormat. A woman with self respect should demand for equality, equity, and egalitarianism. As Patricia was constantly motivated by her guiding principle of empowering women, she often hinted at the possible contribution of feminist philosophy to developing Filipino philosophy. In 2004, she wrote an article in Karunungan entitled Doing Philosophy in the Philippines, Rereading the Canon Through Feminism. I don't agree with the major argument of the paper, but I take Pasricha's recommendation that we should reread Filipino philosophy through perspectives of women's studies or feminist philosophy as a recognition of possible contribution of feminism in the development of Filipino philosophy. Pasricha finds value in the feminist method of resurfacing marginalized voices and practices of systemic exclusion, which are rooted in gender differences, exposing and exploding blind spots of philosophies, which we study as part of the curriculum. In this paper, she lays down a critique of how philosophy is taught in the country, as well as some recommendations which we still might find applicable in our situation today. Pastricia observes that 1. Most of our pedagogical philosophy education in the Philippines is based on the pervasive presence of gender in the philosophical canon and the thematic denigration of women. And 2, there are only 3 women philosophers which are often incorporated in the reading materials of the students, namely Arendt, de Beauvoir, and Wollstonecraft. We might not even be aware that we have forgotten to look for the women philosophers in the reading list that we provide to our students. Given these perceived issues, she recommended that there is a need for a feminist revision of the history of philosophy in general, and we dare add that there is also a need for a feminist revision of philosophy as it is done, read, written, and taught in the Philippines. There's a need for rewriting and reinterpreting or reinterpretation or reinvention of doing philosophy from a feminist perspective. There are two special problems that female Filipino scholars have to look at in doing philosophy: exclusion and denigration. Where have we situated the women philosophers, and how have we interpreted their ideas? Feminist readings of the philosophical canon can challenge derogatory characterization of women because these readings that record the explicit misogyny of great philosophers are valuable. These feminist readings that argue for the gendered interpretations of theoretical concepts are useful. And feminist readings are also into synoptic interpretations of the canon, like the view that reason and objectivity are gendered male in the history of Western philosophy. Now, why are all of these observations and recommendations significant? Pasricha worked on her own without a community of women philosophers. She wrote at a time when Filipino women doing philosophy are barely recognized, with the exception of Emerita Quito, whom she considered as her mentor. Despite the fact that Emerita Quito was a woman, Pasricha opined that she wrote using the male voice. Having this understanding of the power of the female voice makes Pasricha a forerunner in a method of doing philosophy that is sensitive to the underrepresented. She provided the first conceptual tool for thinking as a feminist and as a woman at a time when Kate Mann hasn't written down girl, Miranda Fricker hasn't talked about epistemic injustice, Linda Alcoff's work on decolonizing feminism hasn't reached the Philippines, and Sally Haslanger's rage at the unfair treatment of women in Western academia hasn't echoed in the halls of the University of Santo Tomas. She argued that identity is essential in the formation of Filipino philosophy, but unlike other Filipino philosophers who thought of this so called lack of identity as a barrier towards doing Filipino philosophy, she put her hopes in the contribution of feminism to developing epistemic resources for the development of Filipino philosophy. Now, nurtured by Dr. Pasricha's scholarship, my good friend, Dr. Morella Bolaños, and I co edited a special issue in Critica calling for a more inclusive approach to philosophy. We were thinking along the lines that if we are to move towards a better direction in the manner that we do philosophy in the country, we need to account for more works of women doing philosophy in Philippine academia, having in mind questions such as at what level do we want to bring our philosophizing, and in what manner do we want to take the direction of philosophy forward? We think that one of the many possible replies to these questions pushes us to be more inclusive and find new ways of thinking that could address the undervalued contributions of women who are doing philosophy in the country. We talk about doing philosophy at the margins, but we must check our privileges as members of the academe and become sensitive to the aggressions that academic philosophy has often been blind to. A large part of the impetus for this move is rooted in our experiences as students in the philosophy program of UST, wherein one of our women mentors, included Dr. Josephine Pasricha. And for what better tribute can we offer her other than continuing the work that she started? We just hold on to the possibility that just as we picked up on her hopes for developing a feminist Filipino philosophy, some would also take up the task of venturing into Indian philosophy and make good use of the materials that Dr. Pasricha has left behind. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Darlin, for that uh, edifying presentation. And thank you for making us remember and honor Dr. Josephine Patricia as we take on her recommendation and challenge to all of us to take doing philosophy in the Philippines from the vantage point of feminism. So let's move on to the Q&A as part of this first panel of presenters. So we have Dr. Aguas and Dr. Uh, Demandante. So we have here the first question. Allow me to read. The first question from Mertz Forson. It reads, La Salette Seminary, Silang, Cavite. Questions, do we have, what is this? It's too small. I cannot read.
Do we have a duo of freedom and responsibility?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Aguas.
I think that's the question. So I don't know. I think that question is addressed to me.
Yes, Dr. Aguas.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for the question. Of course, I discussed in my paper freedom, but let's not forget that freedom has a twin brother or twin sister. I always insist this in my class. Don't just talk about freedom, because the twin sister or the twin brother of freedom is responsibility. We cannot speak of freedom without responsibility. Okay, so there is a concomitant. There is, that's the other side of the coin, responsibility. And nowadays we always talk about freedom, 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 freedom. We want to express ourselves, freedom of expression, etc. But we fail to recognize or accept our responsibility for the things that we do, and responsibility for the kind of person we become. So there is always a connection between freedom and responsibility. And although I did not mention that in my discussion, in my presentation, Dr. Nedo always talks about that responsibility, the ability to respond, not only for yourself, but also for other people. So if I help somebody today, I exercise my responsibility. I am able to respond to that other person. So that's my responsibility for him in exercising my freedom.
Thank you. The next question from Seminario San Agustin. How about those who are paralyzed, who don't have such energy to move? Does it mean they don't have an energy to share actually to others? This is also addressed to Dr. Aguas.
Okay, when we talk of capacity, when we talk of the energy or the dynamism, we're not just confining this dynamism to the physicality. In other words, to motion, to movement. That if I cannot move physically, then I can no longer share to others. No, because think, for example, Apolinario Mabini. Apolinario Mabini is confined to his chair. He can barely move. But we know his contribution to cause of our freedom. So there are many ways we can manifest this dynamism, this freedom, in order to be of service to others. So don't think of freedom as simply the freedom of movement, of physical freedom, because as I've said, freedom is always also related to our rational nature.
Okay.
And that's my short answer.
Thank you, Dr. Aguas. We move to the third question from Somaskan, Father's Seminary. So ang dami nating mga questions from the seminarians. Here's again for Dr. Aguas, I guess. Freedom as the autonomous energy is said to be autonomous because it is self-governing, and an energy because
It is a
it
driving
serves
force.
as a driving force.
I think that's a comment.
Do you like to comment on that?
May continuation.
Yeah, there's a continuation. Yes, the dynamism, the empowerment for the being. The for determines a
Oh,
relation of a giver and a receiver, like the phrase, the bread for a child. So I think still a comment. Here we can determine that the bread is not coming from the child, but will be given for him. For the word for indicates that the bread is coming from something else. In relating to the study, there is a subtle contradicting effect happens when we say freedom is autonomous but is for being rather than of being. So, Dr.
okay.
Aguas?
Actually, I was commenting on the comments on YouTube, and I think I have addressed that the distinction between of being and for being. Because when we talk of being, autonomous energy of being, then we connect being to the substantival sense, meaning as something that is already finished. But of course, we can talk of being in the substantival sense, but in the idea, in the notion of Dr. Ornedo, it's more of for being, because he understood being in the participial sense, meaning being as something that is uh, still to be determined. Okay, still. So freedom applies both to the person that is able to actualize himself because he's not yet finished, and he can also help in the actualization of other people because the other person is not yet finished. So it's for my being and for the being others, not of being, because there is a nuance in in the use of being, because we're taking being here in the substantival sense, meaning something that is, to use the word of Sartre, as an end swap, something similar to that. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope that satisfies the comment. Another question? Let me read this one. I think this is for Dr. De Demandante.
Okay.
Ano po ang Filipino feminism sa pananaw ni Dr. Parisias?
Pasricha.
Yun lang, Pasricha, sorry. Yun lang po ang nakaugat lamang sa kalagayan ng sitwasyon ng akademiya ng filosofiya sa bansa. Dr. Darlene, please.
I didn't get the question. I'm sorry.
Let
What
me
is
repeat. Ano po ang Filipino feminism sa pananaw ni Dr. Patricia? Yun lang
Pasricha.
po ba ang nakaugat lamang sa kalagayan ng sitwasyon ng akademiya ng filosofiya sa bansa?
okay? Thank you for the question, sir. And thank you for the question, whoever asked it. Unfortunately, I think Dr. Patricia wouldn't say that there's such a thing as Filipino feminism. When she wrote the paper, her argument was that there are women and men doing philosophy in the Philippines, but we have yet to arrive at achieving, that status of becoming Filipino feminist, because her understanding of Filipino philosophy is also rooted in the understanding of Filipino identity, which according to her hasn't been found yet or hasn't been cleared up. So if it is the case that there's no such thing as a Filipino identity, then for her it follows that there's no such thing as Filipino feminism. But the only thing we have for now are Filipino men and women doing philosophy. And her argument is that if this is the case, then perhaps we can insert, since we are still in the process of developing quote unquote Filipino philosophy, maybe, she says, maybe feminism can contribute something to developing this whole idea of Filipino philosophy, particularly in resurfacing and re-emerging the silence or the silent voices which have been what do you call that? Which have been oppressed or which haven't been heard because our philosophizing which is predominantly Western, is also predominantly male dominated.
Thank you for the question and the answer, Dr. Darlene. Here is another question for Dr. Darlene. For Dr. Patricia, in effectively using feminist frameworks in rereading philosophical canons, does it mean that we have to recontextualize where these canons are situated in? Dr. Darlene?
Okay, thanks again for the question. So, well, philosophical canons are always social historically situated. And what is meant by applying a feminist framework in reading these canons is to read them again by focusing on the silent voices and the voices which have not been let out. So if we do the feminist reading of philosophical texts, it might mean that we will understand that particular text in a totally different way, which we haven't really looked at before. Like, for example, have we ever thought of Kant as a misogynist? Because definitely in his text, he would mention something negative about women. Okay, so those little instances of silences, we might end up understanding the text in a different way, but recontextualization, it might or it might not follow from this kind of reading. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Darlene. The next question. Let me read from Mr. Yalong or Fares Yalong of San Carlos Seminary College. Question to Dr. Aguas. Freedom to what ends? As Sartre once said, that man is doomed to be free.
Okay. Thank you for the question. Now, the end of freedom for Dr. Nedo, based on my presentation, is the actualization of oneself, to actualize oneself, to develop oneself. And when we actualize ourselves, it's not only us who benefits, it's the society, it's the community that also benefited. Okay? So, of course, we can still extend this discussion of what is the ultimate end of man. And I remember Dr. Neto talking about eudaimonia based on Aristotle, and that is human flourishing. Okay, so the ultimate end of our actualizations would be our human flourishing. But I think the question that Dr. Nedo is answering in that essay about human freedom as capacity for being is, how do we attain human flourishing? Is one way of attaining this human flourishing or eudaimonia that Aristotle is talking about is to actualize oneself. And how do we actualize oneself? Well, we have to have this freedom. Now, of course, Sartre talks about that man is condemned to be free, but we have to understand, Sartre, what is the context of that of that pronouncement of Sartre, that we are condemned to be free. We are condemned to be free because, as he said in Being and Nothingness, we are nothing. Meaning, by nothing there, it does not mean that there's really nothing as something that is nihil. Nothing in the sense that nothing defines who we are. We are being. Being in the sense that we are poursuit. We define our being. And how do we define our being? By our freedom. So we are condemned to be free because we have to define who we are. Nobody should define who we are. We are not beings in the substantival sense. We are not finished. We are not poursuit. But of course, we have to admit that for Sartre, there is also the poursuit, meaning the uh, the facticity of the human person that he cannot change. And there's also the transcendent, meaning those things that he can change. So man for Sartre is both these essential features of his existence. There is facticity and transcendence. And of course, I think Dr. Nedo is getting insights from these philosophers, because we know Dr. Nedo to be, he's not just following one strain of thought. He's actually taking in a lot of it, not just in philosophy, but also in education, in anthropology, in culture. He's a Renaissance man, as we say, because he's taking so many things from different areas and from different disciplines. So this idea of Dr. Nedo about freedom is informed of his scholarship, of his many readings, and of his experiences. So I hope that answered the question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Aguas and Dr. Dinamandante, for generously responding to the questions here on a live and also through our chat box. So we'll continue the exchange with the two professors in our chat section. So may I pass the mic now to our MC, Sir Alvin, for the second panel of presenters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you
Thank
very much.
you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Alterado, for that, for moderating for the first part of the session. And thank you very much for the first two speakers. For your other questions, the speakers may respond to you in our YouTube channel.